Hey, everybody. Welcome to Footnotes. Today, we're going to be looking at a sermon that I preached yesterday, March 30th, 2025, titled A Chosen Instrument. In this, we're covering Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 31. And to boil that whole section down into one thing, this is the conversion of Paul into a disciple of Christ. Obviously, if you know the Bible at all, you know we start with Saul. Saul is his Hebrew name, and his Greek name is Paul. And as he was a member of the Pharisees, he was an insider in Jerusalem. He is the Hebrew of Hebrews, is what he calls himself later in the New Testament. But God calls him, and all of a sudden he gives all that up to become Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, to the Greeks, to the Roman Empire, as it were. And so in doing so, when Christ calls Paul, he is calling a person, but also all the things that person is. He doesn't need any of those things. But he calls people and then uses their gifts that he created in order to fulfill his kingdom and press it forward. And so one of the things that we're going to look at today is when he calls Paul. Paul is a member of the Pharisees. Now, if you know your New Testament at all or the Gospels, you know the Pharisees are one of the great enemies of Jesus during his preaching ministry. So it's interesting that he called the group of sort of Jewish bands or denominations, if you will, that were the ones most opposed to him, that he calls one of their members to become his apostle. Why would he do that? So today, what we're going to do is take a very quick look at two of the groups of the Jews, the two main denominations of Judaism. There's three main ones, but we'll look at two of them today and really show why Paul was the choice and why Jesus would pick him to be his messenger. So those two groups are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The third group, called the Essenes, are sort of if you mix like independent fundamentalist Baptists with charismatics that lived in caves. That's the Essenes. So we're not going to really talk about them much today. But we are going to talk about the two groups that would have dominated Jerusalem and Israel, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So let's start with the Sadducees. The Sadducees are most easily described as a priestly aristocracy. So if you know anything about Judaism, you know that in order to be a priest in the temple, you have to be a Levite, member of the tribe of Levi. But to be the high priests and to be the priests that actually do the sacrificial system, you have to be a Levite who is also straight descendant from Aaron himself, Moses' partner in crime, if you will. So the Sadducees are very much the group of Jewish leaders and priests who are in Jerusalem and are part of the power structure. The Sadducees have the most guys on the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish Senate. The Sadducees are the ones who have official contact with Rome. They're in charge of the economy. They're in charge of the religion. They're in charge of the social fabric of Israel. This is the power group. They are the elite of the elites. Now, it's not the same thing at all, but follow me here. It's not that there were no Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, because there were. Nicodemus is one. It's not that there weren't high priests who weren't Pharisees. There were. You need to think of Pharisee and Sadducee as being like a liberal or conservative politically, as we talk about. It's not who you are. It's a set of ideas you've embraced. And so when we talk about the Sadducees, these are people who have embraced a philosophy of Judaism that makes them think about things in certain ways. So you got Levites who are Sadducees, and you'll have Levites who are Pharisees. And even though they're from the same family tree, they have very different ideologies. So the main thing that we're really going to see a distinction in, kind of the number one thing, but there's lots of other ones, The number one thing that divides the Pharisees and the Sadducees is their idea about what happens after death. The Sadducees do not believe in an afterlife at all. They do not believe there is a heaven. They think you just go to the grave and are just dead. You had one life and that's it. That's the Sadducees. The Pharisees believe in a resurrection. They believe there is a life after death. They don't know exactly how to describe it because the Old Testament is very vague about these things, but they do believe there is a life after death. So they lived in very distinct ways. So the way they would interpret the law was very different, and how they lived their lives were very different. One of the big debating points of the time were Sadducees would eat off silver plates and golden plates with silver forks and golden forks and these things. And the Pharisees would eat off clay. They'd eat off clay plates and with, wooden forks and things like that. And the Sadducees had a way of talking about the Pharisees going, they will have good things neither in this life nor the next. We'll have good things in this life because there is no next. So they kind of made fun of them. They're like, you're denying yourselves all these pleasures for nothing that's coming up soon. It was a huge debate way that they sort of went after each other. So this idea that there's no resurrection, there's no spiritual life, really informs how the Sadducees look at things. So a lot of times when we're talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I'll say, well, the Sadducees were more like the theological liberals, and the Pharisees were more like theological conservatives. It's true, but here's a way which they're very opposite. So the Sadducees believed that you could only get Judaism from the Torah and the Tanakh is what they called the whole Old Testament. That you could only find Judaism just in the written words. It didn't matter what teachers said. It didn't matter about anything else. It just mattered the words in the book. They were very book focused. And because of that, this idea of the Torah, especially the first 5 books where the law comes from, Judaism had built a very large, very complicated, very systematized system how to interpret the law, and they called it the oral law. There's the written law in the Torah and the oral law that surrounds it. Sadducees go, nope, just the written law matters. It's the only thing that matters is what is actually in the book. The Sadducees believed that humanity has free will, total free will, that they can choose good or evil, that they are not bound by sin or anything like that, that people are born blank slates and they get to choose which way they will go. And because they are the elites, and because they are, as I said, the priestly aristocracy, the Sadducees were kind of rude. Like they were very rude. They were very classist. They didn't have time for common people. They didn't want anything to do with scrubs, if you follow me. They didn't want anything like that. So they were very elitist, very set apart. They worked in the temple. They were the highbrow people. They were rich. They were very set apart from the commonwealth of Israel. And they had some ideas about the Torah, that it only mattered what was written in the book, and about who humanity is. They're totally free. They're free agents, so to speak. And that there is no destiny, nothing like that. And they just have different ideas. The Pharisees, on the other hand, the Pharisees are relatively new on the scenes compared to the Sadducees. Sadducees would say, we go all the way back to Aaron, which is not totally true. But the Pharisees are very new. They come out of what's called the Hasmonean Revolution. If you've ever heard of the Maccabees, if you ever watch Friends and you're literally in your head going, the Maccabees, right? The Maccabees are people who overthrew Rome, and Israel had a very small bubble of independence about 150 years before Jesus shows up. When the Hasmoneans show back up, and they have this revolution, out of it comes this new caste of Jewish teachers. This is where the Pharisees come from. And so the Pharisees are very different from the Sadducees in some notable ways. And the first one is the Pharisees are very centered around teachers. So if you ever hear about Judaism of the time, there are two schools of Judaism you can follow. One is if you follow the oral law. So if you're a Pharisee, there's two schools. There's Hillel and there's Shammai. These are two great teachers that had lots of distinctives between each other. They weren't on the same page at all about a lot of stuff. And you were either of the school of Shammai or you were the school of Hillel. Paul is going to be from the school of Hillel. Hillel's grandson was a guy named Gamaliel, who, if you listen to the sermon we just talked about, he's considered the greatest teacher in the history of Judaism. Not in his innovation or how he talked about things, but that he took the school of Hillel and made it beautiful. He's considered one of the most important guys ever. And Paul was directly his student. So when you get into the Pharisaical idea, it becomes, who is your teacher? Where did you learn this from? It's not just that you got it from the book. They don't get me wrong. They treasured the physical Torah, and it mattered to them a lot. But it also mattered how it was taught. So they'd say, well, who's your teacher? If I know your teacher, I know what your opinions are on the law, and we can debate it. So we see this in Paul early on, and some of the ways he thinks about things, like considering Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. In the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, Corinth is a church that is in total disarray. And it's in total disarray because they are arguing about which teacher of Christianity they should follow. They're saying, hey, you say you're of Apollos, or you are of Peter, or you are of Paul. And some of you say you're the students of Christ himself. Well, because all those guys are orthodox, all those guys are teaching true Christianity, Paul goes, it doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter who you're teaching, which is a departure from his Pharisees. Do you see? He's saying, I don't care if you're learning from Apollos. I don't care if you're learning from Peter. There's only one religion. There's only one Christianity. There's only one baptism, one word, one Lord, all these things. And if you're learning that from anybody, doesn't matter who your teacher is, because it all comes from Christ. So this is a departure from his Pharisaism. On the other hand, one of the things I think many Christians miss about the New Testament is that literally Paul's every letter of Paul, essentially, he is writing against false teachers. He is answering questions from Christians about false teaching that has come among them. He is a rabid false teacher eradicator. Why? He's a Pharisee. You cannot have false teaching in the group, and he will eliminate false teaching. So if you think about how stridently as the passage we looked at here in Acts 9 says, he was trying to stamp out the new Christians, because to him these are false teachers. They're being led astray by false teachers. They're not of the school of Shammai. They're not of the school of Hillel. They must be eradicated. It's part of his psychology. And so once he becomes a Christian, and is now an apostle for Jesus, he's doing the same thing except for false teachers about Christ. But he's not killing them. He's killing them with the word and with wisdom and with teaching and with, the displays of power that he says the Spirit gives him. Another way in which the Pharisees differed from the Sadducees, where they believed in a predestination of souls, that souls were born and God had a plan for those souls, and that was what would play out. They believed humanity was bound in sin, which is why the law had to be applied in order to escape the judgment of sin. Of course, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to see how that plays into early Christianity and Paul's thinking in Romans and Ephesians and places like that. Of course, they believed in the resurrection of the dead, as we've already talked about. In the book of Acts, there is a place where Paul is on trial in front of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which is the Senate. And being the sharp guy he is, he tells the assembly, they go, why are you on trial? And he goes, I'm on trial because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Well, that immediately starts ideological civil war between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they forget why they're actually trying this dude. Like they're like, but you said Jesus was the Christ. Wait a minute. There is a resurrection. No, there's not. Because he's arguing Jesus was resurrected. So I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And he gets them to infight about it. We're not really talking about him. It's amazing. It's cool. The Pharisees tended to be more metaphorical in their interpretation of the Old Testament. For example, you'll see Pharisees arguing that an eye for an eye meant you have to pay a price equal to that of an eye. They didn't want to pull out the eye, where the Sadducees would have been like, pull out an eye. You would think that would be the opposite, but it's not. The Pharisees were the people of the people. They were the ones who were going into towns and teaching. This is why Jesus had so many conflicts with them and not with the Sadducees. He only had conflict with Sadducees when he is in Jerusalem near the temple. But if he's in any other city or anywhere else, and you'll see the Pharisees came because they were there running the synagogues, ministering to people. They were among the people. The idea of synagogues comes from the Pharisees. They were the ones who said the people have to know their Torah. They have to know what the teachers say. So they were very missionary. They were very, if you will, they were very, let's get the message out to the people. It shouldn't just be in Jerusalem. If you know any history of the time, after Jesus dies, after most of the apostles die, Israel tries to rebel again against the Roman Empire. And this time they run into a Roman emperor who went, and that's it. So Jerusalem is destroyed, just absolutely eradicated. The temple is torn down. It's destroyed. If you're in modern day and you ever hear about the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, that's all that's left of the temple from 70 AD. Never rebuilt it, never got it back. It's still gone. They eradicated it. So once the temple was eradicated, what happens? Well, the Sadducees disappear because there's no temple. It is the Judaism of today is Pharisaism that survived because they built the synagogues in different towns. And so the Judaism we see today is a descendant of that Pharisaical version of Judaism because it's the only one that survived, 70 AD. But it's this particular idea that shows, God elects people not based on anything else, but he also can use what they are. So you look at Paul, he's very missionary. He wants to establish churches in places like synagogues. Early churches ran like synagogues because that's what Paul knew to do. They would meet, they would read the word, they would pray, they would do all the things that they did in synagogue just with Jesus as their object rather than the covenantal understanding of the law. They believe in the resurrection of the dead. They have a high idea of God's sovereignty over our lives. In all these ways, God is using Paul in his life experience to show him, hey, you're a very unique individual who I can use your gifts to spread the kingdom quickly. And in doing so, Paul becomes the apostle of the Gentiles, taking the word of Christ beyond the borders of Judaism and Israel until eventually it goes around the world. So thanks for joining us on Footnotes today. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you next time. We're still in Acts, and y'all take care.